Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Dean's Lecture Series. It's great to see such a good group with us this evening. I almost said in our studio. I guess it is sort of a studio, but I'm also aware, and I welcome the people who are watching on cable TV over the next couple of weeks. So welcome to both of our audiences. The Dean's Lecture Series is a way that we at Western try to give back to the community that supports us in so many ways, and so we're happy to provide some presentations for our community and increase the sense of connection that we have for the support that we feel so grateful for. I want to take an opportunity to thank our supporters and also to say a little bit about tonight's presenter. So Professor Hugo García is with us this evening. And I want to be sure that I say all the important things about him that are on my paper here, because there is a lot to say. First of all, Hugo was born in Havana, and we have a special guest this evening, and that is Hugo's mother, Ms. Freddy Gonzalez. So we welcome her to see. I told him that he has a very difficult audience now. He has a tough audience. Here we go. So, Hugo came to the United States, and in 2006 he earned his PhD in Latin American cultural literatures and cultures at The Ohio State University. We always add the article there, The Ohio State. And 2006 was also a very fortunate year for Western, because that's when he came and began teaching for us. And so he is a beloved instructor in the modern and classical languages department. We have numeric ratings for our professors. They don't really have a label, but if they did have labels like good or very good, Hugo's scores would be in the rock star range on our scale. He really does well, and his students appreciate his instruction. He teaches courses on colonial cities, Afro-Cuban culture, queer studies, as well as Latin American film, and courses in Spanish language. His research includes Latin American colonial satire, visual culture, and Afro-Cuban religions. And in particular, he studies the formation of syncretic religions and popular beliefs in the Cuban colonial context. Now, one way that I look at the Dean's Lecture Series is a way of making connections, and I asked Hugo to speak tonight, not just because he's a fantastic instructor at Western and has that reputation, but also because from what I understand of the Santería religion, there are some important parallels to peoples who have had their religion suppressed, and the ingenious and courageous ways that they find to preserve their culture, including the native peoples on whose land our city and our campus is built. So I'm pleased to hear more about some of those similarities. Now, presentation. I'm sorry, here we go. I want to make sure that I have this right. So, we're going to be taking questions tonight after Hugo is finished, and just one word about how we do that. This microphone will make the rounds so that your question, please speak it into the microphone so that becomes part of the television record. So we have people who will take the microphone to you when you have a question. That way it's recorded, and then Hugo will do his best to answer. The title of his presentation is Santería Decoded: An Approach to the Understanding the Formation of an Afro-Cuban Religion. So please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Hugo García.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to this series of talk. As a starting point for this presentation, we could establish an initial definition. What is Santería? Well, Santería, or Regla de Ocha-Ifá, is a religious system that emerged in Cuba that is in the western area of Cuba, where the cities of Havana and Matanzas are located. Santería arises from the intricate combination of two main religious systems. First, the religious belief of Yoruba cultures and also Spanish Catholicism. The word Santería comes from santos, saints in English, but its more proper name is Regla de Ocha. This is the rule or principle of Ocha. That is the group of orishas, how are called the African gods and goddesses, and Ifá, which is a superior system of divination. Santería or Regla de Ocha-Ifá is not the only Afro-Cuban religion. There is also the Regla Quimbisa, Regla de Palomonte, and the Abacua secret society. Nevertheless, Santería is the most widespread Afro-Cuban religion in Cuba, and also the one that has become more international. Today, Santería has spread through the Caribbean islands, South America, the United States and Canada, and even Europe. The relationship between Cuba and Africa through slavery goes back to 1513, when the first 4 slaves were brought to Cuba from the island La Española. In 1520, a first group of slaves were brought to Cuba directly from Africa. This group was much larger. It was 300 slaves. In the 19th century, there is a boom of sugar production in Cuba, which has a direct consequence, a massive importation of slaves. The greatest concentration of sugar mills that supported the boom of Cuban sugar and the entry of Cuba in the international sugar market was located actually in the western Cuba. Most of the slave population came from 4 major groups: Bantu from the Congo, Yoruba and Igbo from Nigeria, and Arara from the Kingdom of Dahomey, the present-day Benin. The exact number of slaves brought directly from Africa to Cuba is a historical mystery. We will probably never know exactly. It is estimated that the number of African men and women brought to Cuba surpasses 600,000. Nevertheless, this is a conservative estimate. The slave trade was extremely profitable and soon became a fever. The trata negrera, how the slave trade was called, unfolded in 2 main versions. One was legal and therefore was reflected in papers and accounting books of the time. The other version was an illegal slave trade that was never reflected in records, or that was reflected using different denominations, as if the ships came to Cuba loaded with a different merchandise. Once slaves were in Cuba, it was assumed they would be Christianized and converted to the Catholic faith. Most of the time, slaves were baptized and given names in Spain that were associated with saints or different apparitions of the Virgin Mary. A profound and complete religious conversion never really happened. This means the slave population kept alive their original religious and cultural memory while being exposed to the influence of Catholic dominant society. The resulting mixture of this influence provoked the creation of syncretic religions, such as the one that we discussed today. According to the Oxford Dictionary, syncretism is the amalgamation or attempt amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thoughts. Even for those unfamiliar with the Regla de Ocha-Ifá or Santería, this coexistence of elements of dissimilar cultural origin is evident. We find, for instance, that an African deity is associated to a Catholic saint or even with a specific invocation of the Virgin Mary, and both become a single entity, which is the Afro-Cuban Orisha, or god or goddess, as it's revered today both inside and outside Cuba. Just as this happened with the Pantheon, so too there is a syncretic relationship between natural elements, stones, plants, trees, and herbs, and other elements that are the result of industrial processes, porcelain, fabrics like velvet, silk, lame, etc. The material universe of the Regla de Ocha-Ifá will show examples of elaborate porcelain subterranes that we are going to see later, coexisting with a consecrated stone, and velvet, silk, or lace curtains coexisting with offerings of tropical fruits. This quality of syncretic, perhaps because it is familiar, has been assumed as natural. But what is syncretism in this specific case, and how can we explain the emergence of a syncretism in the case of Regla de Ocha-Ifá? Behind the simplicity of the term syncretism applied to this religious system, we can also see the existence of colonial relationships of power with all the complexities with which they develop in the Caribbean islands. To understand the syncretic relationship, we will rely on the term transculturation, coined in 1840 by the Cuban scholar Fernando Ortiz. Ortiz, who among some other things was an anthropologist and ethnologist, realized that back then the available term acculturation that was applied to the cases of cultural transformation faced by slaves did not fit the Cuban case. Acculturation only refers to the acquisition of a new culture, generally a dominant culture. But in the Cuban case, slaves didn't give up to their cultural background. They just incorporated external aspects to their worldview. At the same time, this African culture presence begins to filter into the larger society beyond the slave population. Santería, or Regla de Ocha-Ifá, is just one part of this equation. And it is also one of the most interesting cases in Cuban culture. It is precisely the process of transculturation that allows this syncretism to arise. In the text, Cuban counterpoint of tobacco and sugar, Ortiz explains this neologism, the transculturation, by pointing out that, and I quote, transculturation expresses better the different phases of the transitive process from one culture to another one, because this not only consists in acquiring a different culture, but the process also necessarily implies the loss of or uprooting of a preceding culture, end quote. In the introduction to the same text, Bronislaw Malinowski, considered the father of social anthropology and one-time professor at Yale University, explained that the concept behind the term saying that is the process in which something is always given in exchange for what is received. For Malinowski, it's a give and take. The question that arises from such explanation is, how does these exchanges happen? In what ways does this manifest itself? And above all, at what level does transculturation affect the formation of Regla de Ocha-Ifá? In the formation of the Regla de Ocha-Ifá, the cross-cultural exchanges that take place are much more complex than just a give and take that Malinowski explains. That exchange in which, it is true, both parts of the equation are modified becomes multiple. In the confirmation of this religion, we have the rare privilege of witnessing the creation of a religious system from the bottom up. In the formation of this system, the cross-cultural exchange or transculturation is first double and simultaneous. By that, I mean that there is a horizontal transculturation which happens between peers at the level of the slaves, at the bottom of the social structure of the colonial society. At this level, Africanism is negotiated in a new geography far away from Africa. The second type of transculturation is vertical, and it allows crossing social strata. In this way, slaves allow themselves to appropriate symbolic elements from the Spanish and Creole social elites. But how can we identify and characterize these processes of cultural exchange? To try to answer this question, I suggest that it's essential the techniques of the Japanese kintsugi that could help us to outline models to follow in the effort to understanding different transcultural practices that took place in the Cuban society. Kintsugi is an ancient Japanese art of repairing and recovering broken ceramic pots. The origins of kintsugi are situated in the Ashikaga period in 14th to 16th centuries. The word kintsugi is composed by two essential terms, kin, that means gold, and sugi, meaning union. The word names this art or practice of repairing or remaking pots that have been broken by rejoining fragments with the use of a lacquer or glue enriched with gold or silver powder. The kintsugi process recovers the ceramic piece that would otherwise have been lost, but does not try to redo it as it was originally. On the contrary, the rupture will be incorporated into the piece as part of its own history. The ceramic vessel will be the document that witnesses its own future. The kintsugi process is a refusal to lose a valuable object, is an act of both resistance and creativity. At this point, I will clarify that the Afro-Cuban religion that I want to analyze today and kintsugi have no direct connection. The three different methods of kintsugi are those that will show principles analogous to the processes by which the Africans transplanted to Cuba and their descendants recreate their religious system. Therefore, it's not the practice itself, but the essence of the kintsugi methodology that we have found useful to explore the ways transculturation works. Kintsugi has three different processes, or three different methods. First, the crack method. That is practiced when the broken container can be recomposed with the use of the glue or lacquer mixed with the gold powder. The pieces of the container are substantial and allow the recovery of the piece. However, there are always some small losses of the original ceramic material that manifest itself on the edges of the recovered pieces. This lost material is pulverized, therefore it is rejected in the composition of the new piece and thus disappears. The essence of this method helps us to understand some aspects of the Afro-Cuban religions and the creation of the Regla de Ocha-Ifá in particular. Once in Cuba, Africans regroup according to communalities. The displaced heterogeneous slave population finds common cultural characteristics that will serve as communicating bridges, while other particularities will disappear. The principle of the crack method helped us to understand how the Yoruba pantheon in Africa, that include more than 400 orishas or god and goddesses, was reduced to under 50 orishas. This is just the most famous, the most common orishas. This is not the whole Cuban pantheon. The Cuban-American anthropologist Mercedes Cross Sandoval explained that, and I quote, "In Cuba, only the generic divinities known through Yoruba land, such as the generic gods of thunder, the sea, waters, metals, herbs, and disease, took root. The local gods of lagoons, hills, streams, and brooks failed to do so," end quote. These generic deities that survive in Cuba are what I call the strong orishas, understanding this strength as the greater numbers of followers, often associated with a greater geography in which the cult was practiced in Africa. The local deities become, by virtue of a slave trade, the weak orishas, most of them lost in the cultural transplant. In Cuba, the strong orishas are juxtaposed. They are the equivalent to the ceramic pieces recovered by the kintsugi crack method. Weak orishas come to be that part of memory that is pulverized in the time, and they come to disappear in the cracks of history. The strong orishas that managed to survive the transfer of the African population established new relationships among them. As happens with the ceramic pieces united by the glue impregnated with gold dust, the orishas who settle in Cuba are reunited by new bonds that in many cases result in sentimental and family ties previously unknown. These new orisha relations resolve possible distance between them, eliminate occurrence of disconnection, and unite the new pantheon. In some other cases, the new orisha in Cuba is the result of combining different cults to the same orisha in different African regions. As examples, I will refer to two orishas in particular, Obatala and Oshun. They are two orishas that show exactly the transformational progression between Africa and Cuba. Obatala is, in Santería or Regla de Ocha-Ifá, an essential entity responsible for the creation of the human. Everything indicates that Obatala cult was extended in all areas of Yoruba culture in Africa, but Obatala in Africa was worshipped in different ways according to local traditions, which is to say that each group had a particular version of the same divine entity. In Cuba, Obatala has multiple manifestations of all paths. In some myth, he is a male warrior, in some others, an old man, and yet in some others, an old lady or even a young woman. This variety of identity is caused by Cuban absorption of all the local cults of Obatala from different areas of Nigeria. The Obatala that we know is exactly the juxtaposition of its different African versions. With this solidification of Obatala, the geographical and cultural disparities are solved. Those many different paths of Obatala in Cuba are never questioned because he is a major orisha, associated, how I said before, with the creation of everything but including his followers. He encompasses everything he creates. This central position comes to justify that he can be one and many at the same time. But even more important for us, Obatala becomes a great example of the capacity of African slaves for cultural negotiation. The other interesting case in this evolution is the one that occurs with the waters and the rivers. Oya and Otba, which in Africa were two different goddesses of rivers, in Cuba give up all those waters, and Oshun is the one that becomes the singular Isha of all rivers. Oshun in Cuba becomes a communicating force for all the waters of all rivers, and it comes to unite the population of Yoruba origin from the fact that under her cape all fluvial resources are places without any distinction. Another relevant transformation while establishing the religion in Cuba is related also to the relationship between believers and deities. This is a religion in which the believers dedicate herself to worship one main specific Orisha that is settled in the believer's head. But before to go to this point, the initiated has to receive some other previous Orishas that are called the warriors. In Africa, the initiated receive the warriors and only his or her main Orisha that will come to settle in the head of the person. In Cuba, on the contrary, the initiated receive what is called a set of Orishas. Mercedes Cross-Sandoval explains that the candidates for initiation normally receive 4 warriors, Elegua, Ogun, Oshosi, and Oshun, and later on, generally during the initiation, will receive what is known in Cuba as the fundamental Orishas, Obatala, Yemaya, Chango, and Oshun. And also, on top of that, the main Orisha that goes to the head. This means that the initiated in Cuba is directly in contact with a much larger section of the pantheon. One explanation could be that Africans were influenced by the relationship Spaniards had with the many Catholic saints whose sculptures were present in the Catholic temple. At the same time, this larger amount of Orisha guarantees a rapid insertion of the subject, the African subject, in a structure that now provides much more powerful protection. In this religious system we analyze, the Orisha become father and mother of the initiated, that are the children. The sponsors of religious mentors, to whom I will refer later on, will be the godparents, and the initiated, the godchild. Godparents' house will take the place of the family home, where the Orishas are worshipped and the family social ties are strengthened. Africans and their descendants create a parallel society where mortal human subjects and divine entities are assimilated in the same structure. And at this moment, I want to go to the second method of the Japanese kintsugi practice. The second method is the method of the pieces. According to kintsugi practice, this method of recovering a ceramic piece tries to fill empty spaces. It is no longer a matter of joining fragments with a binder, but trying to also fill spaces left by sections of the original material that were completely lost. These spaces will have to be filled with a glue compound and gold powder, and in aesthetical terms, they will remain as new sections that are added to the original piece. This principle facilitates us understanding insertions of elements in the religious system that, although they are foreign to African cultures, they do not come to create a total rupture. On the contrary, these elements are easily inserted because they come to fill those areas of emptiness left by the slave trade. In this category of associations, the linguistic aspect is relevant, since a good number of concepts and words are taken from the Spanish and Creole society and religious and family structure. For instance, I just mentioned the godparents, the godchildren. These Catholic concepts are organically integrated where slavery had left a void. We find a similar case in the associations called cabildos. Translation for the cabildos will be the incumbents of the church. But these were associations just for Africans, where the African groups will join according to their ethnicity, and they open the space for social relationship, religious practices, and even support in difficult times. Now, in the internal structure of these cabildos, we will find a king, a captain, a queen, and a flag bearer, as different ranks that reproduce the symbolic organization of the colonial society. Having lost all kinds of human relationship, transplanted Africans will need these long words to reconstruct their family and social fabric. Another insertion under this same principle is precisely the Catholic temple. The new initiated, called Iyawo, in Africa was brought before the religious and government authority of the area. In Cuba, they are taken to the Catholic temple that becomes the colonial religious authority. The Catholic temple replaces the African hierarchy, but this visit to the Iyawo, or initiated, to the temple can be explored even further, because in Africa, the visit of the initiated to the authorities was a conscious act in which all the involved parties were fully aware. In Cuba, this visit is marked by a secrecy that makes it very interesting, because in a silent way, Africans forced the institution Catholic Church to participate in the Afro-Cuban religion. In other words, the Catholic institution involuntarily has an important role in the ritual of a religion that has been traditionally marginalized. And we can recognize the initiated people because during the first year they have to dress completely in white, and they have to protect the head. Under the method of pieces, we can also refer to the vestments used in the Regla de Ocha-Ifá, especially the ritual vestment for the initiation, with the insertion of materials such as lamé, lace, silk, tulle, and an endless number of decorative elements, sequins, rhinestones, etc. This incorporation of foreign materials can be understood because enslaved Africans had lost their material world, but later they can easily comprehend the symbolic set of meanings of materials in the colonial Hispanic society. The power imposes its logic through the visual image. Color, textures, and materials were essential part of the language elaborated by the colonial powers. There is a visual code reserved for the privileged class, and the symbolic dimension of this language is easily understood by African and their descendants, and they incorporate them to the symbolic material world of the newly formed religion. Another process in the Japanese kintsugi that I am taking to structure my approach to the Afro-Cuban religion, Regla de Ocha-Ifá, is the joint call. Previously, we have discussed two main ways to recompose society and religious structures, as it happens in this religion. In the first type of cases, Africans establish a horizontal negotiation. In the second type of cases, the negotiation becomes vertical to reach the highest strata of the colonial society. The similarity in those two cases is a constant closing gaps, filling voids, and finding a conciliation. Somehow, both methods attempt to recover what has been broken. But there are cases when we find a pure act of creativity. For these cases, which we will explain below, we propose this kintsugi method, the joint call. This method is practiced when unrelated ceramic fragments are different in color, shape, and composition, but they are combined to create a completely new object. It is not a way to recover, but it's an act of creation. In the Afro-Cuban religion that we analyze, we will find entities conformed by elements that originally were completely dissimilar. And this is the case of one of the main orishas called warriors, Elegua. On the left, you have the consecrated stone, what people will have in their house, so the visual presence, but also the dancer that represents Elegua. You have in the center, and you have on the right side the image with the syncretized Elegua with the image of the Jesus child of Atocha. So in the Catholic Church, this will be the image that the Africans will relate to Elegua. Afro-Cuban populations show, how I was saying, its most creative side and incorporates elements that could only be brought to the religion system by the influence of a high dose of creativity. One of the most forced insertions, despite of being accepted as natural, is exactly to bring the Catholic saints to a religion of an African foundation. Two other interesting cases will be Oshun and Shango. Oshun becomes associated with the Virgin of Charity, the patron virgin of Cuba. The African goddess Oshun in Cuba is, how I mentioned before, in charge of all rivers. But the Catholic Virgin of Charity appears in the sea. This is a curious fact that elevates the level of the contradiction. In the iconography of the Virgin of Charity is added the boat with the three men and the storm that refers to the apparition of the Virgin in Cuba. What you have on the left is the original Virgin that was supposed to appear floating in the waters when the three men that were going to looking for salt suddenly found themselves in the middle of a storm. What you have, the middle and the right, is how the Virgin was transformed and how is understood. According to the legend, these three men were sailing in search of salt, how I was telling you, in the Bay of Nipe in eastern Cuba. And they were surprised by a storm. The Virgin appears and saves their lives. This anecdote becomes essential to both the Catholic but also the national imaginary. Since 19th century, what is represented is not just the Virgin, but instead the conditions under which the Virgin appears in Cuba. This is the the storm, and the sinking boat with the 3 men in danger. This inclusion of the anecdotal reference of the Virgin reinforces the relationship of the Virgin of Charity with the sea. However, the African Ochun and the Catholic Virgin of Charity merge. And this image of the Virgin of Charity is assumed to be representation of Ochun, the Orisha of the rivers. The marine representation is not taken as a river representation, it is just ignored. The complex entity Ochun, the Virgin of Charity, is definitely placed in charge of all rivers. The other Orisha I want to present in this category is Shango, who arrives from Africa as a male thunder entity and establishes himself in Cuba as the alpha male of the Afro-Cuban pantheon. He is hardworking, brave, a good friend, but also a player, a liar, and a womanizer. In addition to all those characteristics, in Cuba, Shango is syncretized with Saint Barbara. How then to understand the association of this hypermasculinity with the image of a young, white, and martyred woman who is Saint Barbara? And this is different representations of Saint Barbara. The associations of the African Shango with the Catholic Saint Barbara is explained by the following legend. And this is what the story says. Shango married the goddess Oba, but he also had relationships and even lived with 2 other goddesses, Oya and Ochun. Oya was Ogun's wife, but she fell in love with Shango and allowed herself to be even robbed by him. This abduction gave rise to a war between Shango and Ogun. One day, Shango was with Oya in her house, and Shango's enemies were looking for him. They wanted to kill Shango. With his enemies outside the house, Shango had not many possibilities to escape. Then is when Oya became inventive and cut her braids and put them on Shango's head. She also dressed Shango with her clothes. When Shango left the house wearing Oya's clothes and hair, his enemies believed they were seeing at Oya and let him to escape. Between the Shango that comes from Africa and the Catholic Saint Barbara, there opens up a large valley of difference that could only be covered by the ductility shown by the African cultures. The story of Shango, dressed as a woman, which is Saint Barbara, offers us the only visual snapshot of Shango's life we have. Curiously, the god of masculinity can only be seen as a woman. This anecdote of circumstantial cross-dressing is a very creative way to mitigate the intensity of the collision between Shango and Saint Barbara, of course, always preserving Shango's masculinity. In addition, how I mentioned before, the material universe of the African slaves is lost when they are captured and transported to America. Once in Cuba, they are exposed to a new material repertoire that they comprehend and they appropriate. Pieces of furniture, fabrics, gemstones, materials in general that were previously unknown to the African subject come to form the visual world of this religion and the society that practices. Among these materials, one of the most interesting cases, these are altars that are called thrones. And you can recognize the main orisha that is dedicated because always is in the center, but also because the color code associated to each orisha. But in all this visual repertoire, one of the most important elements is the subterraneans. African slaves might have discovered these subterraneans in the luxury houses of the owner of the sugar mills, the coffee plantation, or in the city houses. For the subjects living under conditions of slavery, the subterranean probably represents freedom and later the access to food or to the possibility of sharing food, but also the access to sumptuary objects and possibilities for decoration. The Afro-Cuban population adopts the subterraneans as the recipient for the sacred stone that represents the orisha, because the luxury reveres the orisha, the aesthetic adorns, and the concave interior of the terrain hide the consecrated stones. The subterraneans are one of the best demonstrations of amalgamation of the natural and the industrial, the African and the European. The subterranean becomes a metaphor of the Caribbean cultures in general, Africa and Europe, but not in Africa, neither in Europe. Rather, in this third location that will produce a third cultural and religious system, such as Regla de Ocha-Ifá. And I have, this is subterraneans in Miami. There are all types of them, all prices for all types of affordabilities. There is no doubt that in 1940s, to conclude, the term transculturation came to fill a gap in anthropology and cultural studies, and the concept was an undeniable contribution to the efforts to explain the cultural exchanges that took place under conditions in which two or more cultures come in contact, with what results in a third syncretic product. Transculturation as a concept is at the very center of the formation of many cultural realities that we can experience today in Caribbean islands. The religious system of Ocha-Ifá is just one example. However, transculturation is not a simple process. There is not a direct and easy exchange of cultural elements. The cultural exchange that takes place between two groups in contact takes unpredictable routes. The case I have presented, the Afro-Cuban religion of Ocha-Ifá, proves that transculturation could be one and many at the same time. This complexity compels us to determine that there are at least three principles that can help us to trace some manners in which the syncretic final product is achieved through a transcultural exchange. The crack method, the pieces method, and the join call that I have extrapolated from Japanese practice of kintsugi can offer a path to beginning the search for explanation regarding Afro-Cuban syncretism. These three methods offer us principles to decode a syncretic reality by grouping elements and charting out the ways in which cultural aspects intertwine. By doing so, we can read our contemporary experience and discover the layers of historical, economical, and social factors comprised in our own culture, our own current cultural experiences. Thank you so much.
Now, please, questions for Hugo?
Hi. I was just wondering how Santería is viewed today in Cuba by the rest of the country, and is it still marginalized, as you explained earlier?
it has a complicated relationship with many things. First, with the racial discrimination. Forever, it has been seen as something completely African, which is not true. It has been practiced by people who are not African descendants, even, forever. But for a long time, nobody will even mention the practice. It has the advantage of being practiced at home or in houses. So it's not a public space practice. But also, for a long time, depending on the historical period, the festivities they celebrate were not permitted inside the city because they played drums and the noise. So it was, for many reasons, discrimination, political reasons, some sort of a government in cities, laws or ordinances, for many reasons, was always left out of the open conversation. Lately, in the last years, since the second half of 1990s, it has been a little bit more open than it was before. Since the reestablishing in Cuba of Christmas, after the Pope, John Paul II, went to Cuba, of course, it's not that John Paul II had anything to do with African religion, but since it was permitted to the Catholic practice, and this is so attached to the Catholic practice, and it's another religious practice, so it has been also more flexible, the environment for practice. Also, with the beginning of the tourism in Cuba, also in 1990s, after the Soviet Union disappeared, there is some sort of a spread of the religion. Before it was spread to Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Miami, LA, but now is in Europe, Finland, and there is even the concept of being initiated in Cuba. So suddenly Cuba comes in the international arena with a practice of this religion like some sort of a important place to be consecrated in, no? So some sort of a secret place to go. So right now, again, it's a little bit more flexible. People are a little bit more open. But for a long time, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that discrimination disappears. It doesn't mean that everybody will see it completely fine. But it's a little bit more flexible. It's a little less difficult. No?
I have a question for you, Professor Garcia, and it's about why the Santería didn't take off in this country.
Well, I am not a specialist in American history, culture, anthropology, or anything like that, no? But basically, the one important factor has to do with the amount of slaves and the possibility of those slaves keeping or not their original religion system of thought In the Catholic tradition, let's say, slaves were never taught to read or write because they were not supposed to read the Bible. They were supposed to be converted, but the Bible they will use, they will hear the Bible if they were taken to church. So the conversion becomes very superficial because they are not really converted, they are just baptized. But there is not the mental white out to erase memory and start from ground zero. So I believe that in the United States it happens, the conversion happens in a different way, but I am not a specialist in that area, no? So I cannot say too much about the conditions of a assumption of a new religion by slaves in the United States.
So I've got a question about how you see things developing in the future. I know that in Korea, for example, there's a tension over the traditional shamanic practice, which is simultaneously sort of seen as not modern, but at the same time has become a treasure, a national treasure, a tourist, and performances of shamanism have official backing. And I'm wondering, do you see in the future in Cuba a development of official performances of Santería that are intended for an international audience?
Well, it's already happening. There is even, this was something that people will practice again, completely private, something that people will hide, at least very much until 1984, when a song, a salsa song, came out saying, how to translate this? When you go to someone, a priest, in Santería, and that priest can use the divination system to read your future, they tell you your past, they tell you what's going on with you, what is the future, they give you solutions, including herbs, plants, etc. They call consultarse, to go into a consult. And this song came out in 1994 that said, hay gente que te dice que no creen en nada y van a consultarse por la madrugada. And some people tell you they don't believe in anything, but they go to consult themselves after midnight. The song was very successful, because, not only for what it said, but because it was like Despacito. It was very contagious. So it became a national success. But also, it's very interesting how that song made people to become a little bit more flexible, and to become a little bit more open. Probably the song provides the less serious, through music and dance platform to become more transparent in terms of what I think and what I don't have to hide, etc. But there is an association, a national association of cultural association of Yoruba. That is actually a very central place. It has a big building in front of a Capitol building. This association is supposed to gather, to put together all these priests, male and female, because there are the two gender. So it's already happening. It's already happening, and there are performances. Always performances exist. I have a painting in my office that actually I did in one day of nostalgia when I was in Ohio. Just seeing one of those performances by a professional group, because there are dancers, how I showed before, there are a dancer becomes the god or the goddess. No? And this group, the Yoruba and Dabo, was a professional group that will play the songs in Yoruba language. The Yoruba language is still spoken, so it's the language of the for the practice. Of course, with variations, it's like a Creole Yoruba, but it's basically Yoruba language. But these performances were just something very cultural and very limited, no? Now there are many other ways to witness, to see, to participate in these performances, much more open, much more accessible. No? Sometimes even in streets. But it's already happening. It has been happening already for probably 20 years. That assimilation of these relegated, discriminated sides of the culture to the mainstream. No?
I know that Hugo will be able to take questions outside, but let's take just a minute to thank him for such an interesting and beautiful presentation.
Thank you for coming.